Okay, let's talk about Orwell, the guy who wrote both Animal Farm and 1984 that we're going to read after 1984. So we learned a little bit about utopia in Block today. So your question now is, how was Orwell's worldview shaped? And do you think he was a utopian? Do you think he was an idealist? Or do you think he'd kind of lost that idealism and had become a cynic? I think we can make a prediction based on that, based on his life events, since the way that people live usually shapes the way they see the world. So let's look at where Orwell started. When Orwell was really little, he was Eric Blair, and Orwell is actually his pen name. He was born in India. What do we know about Britain in 1903? You should remember, if you remember anything, that it was colonized. And you know also a little bit about how the British were treated and how the Indians were treated in British colonized India. Eric Blair / Orwell actually went back to England for fancy boarding school, so he's educated in England. And in the 1920s, he got his first job after college, and he worked for the British Secret Service, which is kind of like our FBI. And his job was to try to keep the Indians from uprising against British rule. So your question is, what kind of things do you think he saw on his job? Do you think he saw things that would make him feel optimistic or pessimistic about society? That's his beginnings. After that, he started to gain some new political ideas between when he was age 24 and his mid-30s. When he came back to England in 1927, he wasn't really comfortable with the ideals of his parents anymore, and he felt like he'd turned against imperialism, he wasn't into the upper middle class that he'd grown up in, and he started to live among the poor. He got a new job, and he worked for a newspaper, and he became a socialist, which means that he believed in a stronger government supporting people. So here's a picture from the Socialist Party, the Labour Party, that he might have worked for. There's some communist propaganda from that time, and then a picture of a newspaper office in London in the 1930s. That's useful to help us picture both Orwell and also Winston in 1984, who's going to work in a remarkably similar situation to where Orwell lived or worked when he was in his 30s. Okay, let's look at some of the things that influenced his big novels at the time that he was writing them. He actually started writing in the 1940s in World War II, and he was in the British Home Guard, which is like our American National Guard. But at the same time, he must have been working on Animal Farm because that was published in 1943. It was critical of Stalin's socialist leadership in Russia, and you will see that as we read it. But because Russia was actually an ally of Britain in World War II, it was actually really hard to publish a book that seemed like it was critical of Stalin. But it's kind of weird that he was critical of Stalin's socialist leadership, because you should remember from the last slide that Orwell himself was a supporter of socialist government. So if he was critical of Stalin, who was also a, quote, socialist, what do you think we can guess about Stalin's form of government and why he might not have supported that? After that, in 1984, get it? 48, 84, came out, and this was overtly critical, not in the kind of subtle way that Animal Farm was, but was overtly critical of totalitarian leaders like Hitler and Stalin and their societies. And try to think about anything else that we've seen with totalitarian societies so far, especially if you read about North Korea over the summer. So here's a picture of the original cover of Animal Farm and a more recent cover of 1984, and then a picture of Hitler and Stalin being pretty buddy-buddy with each other from a political cartoon around that time. Okay, so let's think about some of the key events that shaped Orwell's thinking as he was coming up with his ideas for his books and actually writing those books. He saw the Russian Revolution happen in the early 1900s and saw the ideal and the promise of socialism and communism, and then saw that same ideal descend into totalitarian rule. He saw World War I and actually and worked with the British government as they tried to oppress people who were rising up against the government. He saw Stalin come to power and corrupt this promise of socialism. He saw Hitler come to power in Germany and all that involved. And then when World War II was over, he was faced with the Cold War and the ongoing threat of global warfare and nuclear warfare. So guess at this point, do you think he was more of an idealist, or do you think he was more of a cynic? Go ahead and think about that, and then go ahead and answer your collaborative discussion. I'll be interested to hear what you think.